It's currently 7:18 a.m., Wednesday the 8th of January 2025. In my previous recordings, I mentioned that I would make a follow-up video mentioning the avenues for creating voices. So firstly, I'd like to go over the brief history of the term voice-to-skull or V2K. We first heard of this term being used to reference the Frey effect, otherwise known as microwave hearing, and this term was found on a military website listing the hoped capacities for a non-lethal directed energy weapon. Now, this weapon was initially listed as Medusa, or the mob excess deterrent using silent audio. Though it was taken down around 2007, you can still find remnants of it online. Now, Medusa was repurposed into a form of crowd control using dielectric clicks on someone's skin to make someone jump out of the way, which is a much more preferable means of crowd control over microwave hearing.
All without permanent harm.
It only penetrates 1/64 of an inch of your skin, goes very shallow into where your nerve receptors are, and there's no permanent injury caused by it. Very safe system. We've built in some safety margins.
Now, the ADS has a range of around 8 football fields it's measured in, but I'm sure they could make it go a lot further. Now, this is a non-lethal form of weaponry, though I'm sure it could be utilized in more covert means or more overt means in terms of lethal capacity. Now, there are military papers out there like bioeffects of selected non-lethal weaponry that show specific details, but also how familiar they are with developing technology like this, and then also letting on to the idea of future capabilities of this tech too. Now, microwave hearing entails the production of thermoelastic clicks from the brain, which expands and hits the skull, creating an audible effect like bone conduction. The sound itself is mostly always unintelligible unless someone is informed beforehand on the event of the intended words transmitted. And this is mainly the reason why for Medusa's discontinuation, where the energy density requirement is far too high to really convey any form of intelligible dialogue, but also if you're trying to deter a mob with loud sounds using microwave, you're most likely going to end up causing brain damage. Now, microwave hearing, when looked at as V2K, is often utilized with a form of what you call radio frequency hearing. And so you have pulsed microwave clicks, but then you also have radio frequency utilized to create a sine wave like sound, which starts to synthesize a form of garbled speech. Now, there's been many experiments with this, but typically you'd still need knowledge of the words beforehand to really interpret what's being sent to you. However, there are many ways of overlaying this effect to deliver a much more intelligible transmission. But it's also worth noting how the brain is a pattern recognition machine, firstly, and how there are words like names or specific medical terminology, something that the brain might be able to pick out from the garbled noise due to its unique kind of sound. Another thing to pay attention to is how it doesn't necessarily have to be audible. You could have it as a form of subliminal, which will click upon the skull and the subconscious might become sensitized to certain words or even cues to remote influence someone. I think for some, microwave hearing would be better to refer to as artificial telepathy, for the experience is very different to the typical form of voice hearing. There is a division between targeted individuals or victims of gangstalking who receive no external voices, but rather the sensation of a voice speaking in their head. This is a form of microwave hearing, and it can be paired with a wide range of tools to increase its potency. For those that hear voices externally, the same is done. Many tools are combined to create this unfortunate 24/7 torture and harassment many of us go through, myself included. I'm going to try and briefly break down the mixed methods that I can detect being utilized to create this, what I would label a designer psychosis. Firstly, we have the manipulation of the cardiovascular system. Now, I find my blood pulsing so strong it's almost like I've got my hand against a window with sound running through it. This is further made worsened by my blood pulsing deep in my ear, giving me a form of pulsatile tinnitus. Now, I've had this pulsing on my left-hand side ever since I was little, and if I ever turned around onto this side while sleeping, I'd end up waking with a nightmare alongside the sound of this sort of hissing and whooshing sound from my left ear. Now it's so deep in my ear I can't hear it, but if I push on my jugular, it can slowly become audible. Now, layered on this is a sort of tinnitus, a sort of hissing sound, or a high-pitched frequency. This all plays into heterodyning sound around me, which I can record, often coming from my devices or from extension cables, and it'll follow me into rooms if I end up spending enough time there. I will now show you 2 examples of the kind of sound harassment I receive. Now, I can use a handheld radio and I can scan around the room that I'm spending the most time in, and what you'll find is that dirty electricity is being pumped in through the mains and from the devices too. But if I swap rooms eventually, that dirty electricity will follow me into this new room and in the previous room no longer be present. All of this plays into creating noise around me. Furthermore, I suspect there are forms of infrasonic and ultrasonics being used around me, and all of this is utilized to heterodyne in my ear to create a audible experience where only I'm really receiving it. Now, I'm sensitized to these sounds, so these are pulse communications. They don't necessarily need to carry all the information for someone to hear at full capacity, especially when you sensitize someone to this audio. So, firstly, you have to learn about the amygdala. The amygdala has a fear, negativity bias, and disgust response that overrides long-term memory recall and decision-making. So, as an example, if there is a snake out in front of you and it lunges at you, your body is going to learn pretty quickly it's not a very nice thing, and it'll make you jump out the way without you even having to think about it. Now, you can train the amygdala to sense for all kinds of things, and if you're sensitized, you'll start hearing words in the subjective sound thrown at you. In my own experience, after a very direct form of conversation with them, where I believe they were using things like LRAD or long-range acoustic devices, they suddenly became quite quiet with a lot of subjective noise flooding my surroundings, and where I quickly learned to hear certain narratives being thrown at me over and over again, or the word like retard or some other form of profanity, in where I started to have a believable experience that they were still talking to me, and they kept me in some locked state where they would trigger the amygdala through just controlling the tonality of sound. Now, this can be applied with microwave hearing too, where you could condition a psychosis, going round and round again with subjective sounds, but giving enough input to create a plausible discussion where somebody's sensitized to the sound and starting to hear voices specifically fitting to the narrative. Now, the narrative could be intentionally hand-fed to them or could be produced by the mind itself. In my opinion, it could very well be a 50-50, part you, part them, in this sort of joint psychosis, that they only need to control a slight bit to keep you entrained 24/7. And this plays into the guerrilla warfare of the mind, and I'll leave this for another recording to explain why this is happening and why it's a guerrilla warfare. But the narrative can be built up by your amygdala too, and threat sensing, and as you get sort of subconsciously programmed by having biases, thinking that people out on the street are making hand signs at you, and I'm sure there are some, but you get sensitized and you start believing people are stalking you when they're not. And then this narrative builds and builds and builds until you see weird synchronicities, weird coincidences overlap, and you start to confirm to yourself that, okay, well, this is a new input, and so now the amygdala gets triggered for this type of input that you wouldn't normally be conscious of, and because you're being triggered of it, you think it's happening more often, so it must be true. And you end up in this sort of pitfall, and the narrative gets more and more schizophrenic. And this is the thing, this is how they create plausible deniability. Now back to the hearing. Medically, for a lot of TIs, I noticed their pinkies are swayed off to the side, and also their little toe. And what's happening is they're being manipulated, they're being sort of moved and jittered about alongside the type of words being thrown with them, and this creates a form of emotional input, but also a physical feeling. Now, all of these methods can be overlaid in junction with one another to create this experience, and where they can have very direct communication or just keep you talking with partly your psychology and an AI. And this is exactly what I see in pretty much every other TI. I'm sure there's many other methods out there that are utilized on TIs to create this hearing experience. One interesting one I can mention is that there is often graphene oxide found on TIs, and that graphene can actually be used. So Nokia put out tattoos a while ago, where if you got a text message, it would start to vibrate. And that vibration in the skin is one way you could potentially infer and condition making someone hear something. I noticed in my situation, my muscles twitch, not just my fingers, but they'll actually move my jaw, my arms and my tongue to mouth out words. And I'm not sure if this is due to the repetition of certain phrases constantly, or if they've got something to manipulate these muscles in a certain way. Now, I'd like to end this recording with a clip from Look Out for Charlie, who goes over the audio analysis of pulse communications, subliminal pulse communications.
Now, I'm going to show you a clip of ambient sound that I recorded the other night at 4 a.m. It's not about the sound itself, right? And this is kind of hard to explain. It's where you cut the ambient sound, where you find what's hidden within it. It's like finding a signal within a signal, late at night on a very, very quiet street. So there's just sound, and I think I boosted it about 15 decibels, so let's listen to it for a couple seconds. Just sound. Now, here is the same audio, just adjusted, and where I cut the frequency. Check this out. You're going to hear what's within that sound. Now, anybody with ears, you can hear something is just rambling on and on. But if you keep working with this audio, you can get rid of all the noise around it and start to pull out what is actually there.
This one is not good.